live on WFLA Now. With a specialized degree in climate, Chief Meteorologist and Climate Specialist Jeff Berardelli is pioneering the way we look at climate and extreme weather. Welcome to Jeff's Climate Classroom, powered by ArmorView Window and Door.
Happy Thursday, everybody. I am Chief Meteorologist and Climate Specialist Jeff Berardelli. I want to thank you for joining me today for a topic that I've had a lot of interest for a very long time, and that is public opinion on climate change, which certainly has elevated over the past several years, but not very quickly, at least in my opinion. However, here in the state of Florida, it turns out that when you compare it against the average understanding of climate change and the acceptance that humans are causing climate change, public opinion is higher here in the state of Florida. Now, to discuss that, I want to welcome my guest right here. He is Dr. Colin Polsky. He's the founding director of Colin Polsky. Sorry about that. Founding director of the School of Environmental, Coastal, and Ocean Sustainability at FAU. He is also the founder of the Climate Resilience Survey, which he's been doing since 2019. And I have definitely read this survey. The reason why I say that is when you published it earlier this year, I was surprised at the difference between Floridians' understanding of climate change versus the rest of the country. I wouldn't have thought that Floridians would have had a greater acceptance of climate change, at least to the degree that your survey shows. So just one thing I want to point out before we move on, at this point, 90% of adults in Florida believe that climate change or understand that climate change is happening. That's 84% of Republicans. And when you compare that to national results, it's closer to 75%, Colin. So can you tell me more about that?
Well, definitely. I'm delighted to be here to talk about this survey. So as you say, here at FAU, we've been running this Florida Climate Resilience Survey every 6 months since 2019. And the results that we have, and they're all published on our website, all the raw data are there. You can download them. The press releases are there and such. Has been a pretty consistent, surprising if you are familiar with the national trends in public opinion, result that in Florida, there's a greater acceptance of the phenomenon, climate change, as something that's real, that's happening, and that's largely human caused.
Yeah, speaking of the human caused, 65% in your latest survey of Floridians understand that climate change is human caused, whereas nationally that understanding seems to be closer to the high 50s or even 56% in the Yale George Mason survey that I looked at. So what do you think is going on here? Why do Floridians better understand or accept the realities of climate change?
Well, it's an even wider margin when you look at a collection of other polls, somewhere around the 60s to the high 40s. But as you say, in some polls at the national level, it's in the mid 50s. I think here the kind of default hypothesis we have to consider and explore, and we're doing that, is that in Florida, climate and weather are kind of a daily thing in people's lives. More so compared to other parts of the country. Now, obviously, that's not to say that climate and weather aren't important elsewhere, but here, this is my 10th year living here now. I'm not a lifelong Floridian, but I love it here. In Florida, you know, whether it's hurricanes or flooding, and whether you're experiencing it personally every day or every week or not, it is in the news, local news here a lot. So preparing for high winds, storm surge, tidal flooding, and the like just seem to be part of the daily parlance. And so the result is, and this is not the only possible explanation, but it's kind of the first one we have to look at, is that people are more open to it because it's more of a daily topic of conversation. And that would cut across parties.
So it's part of their experience. It's part of their lived experience. And that's something that I was saying recently to a meteorologist colleague of mine, that if you do the survey in February, you'll probably find less people believe that climate change is happening. But if you did it in August, you'll find more people believe that climate change is happening. That's not just for Florida. That's all over the United States, right? When it's hotter, you believe it's happening. When it's not hot, you don't believe it's happening. So people's lived experience, and it goes back and forth, right? You see the polls go up after a big climate event and then down after there hasn't been a big, extreme climate event for a while.
Yes, there's some of that, and that's natural. And if you look at the broader question of public opinion on general set of issues that might be of interest to them, climate is never in the top 2 or 3 among all issues that Americans are thinking about, and the same applies in Florida. But it's kind of further down the list or closer to the top, depending on what other major things are underway. For example, COVID or a war or a recession. These things tend to distract people's attention from climate, and I'm not being critical. It's kind of natural. But we do see some ups and downs that we think tracks a bit with some of these non-climate events.
Now, nationally and even across the state of Florida, when you look at the difference between political parties, Democrats and Republicans, Democrats almost universally accept that climate change is happening, and most believe that climate change, or accept the science of climate change, is caused by humans. Now, in the state of Florida, looking at the polls in terms of Republicans, 84% of Republicans understand that climate change is happening. Nationally, that's, and this is from the Yale George Mason poll, 61% of moderate Republicans believe that climate change is happening, and 46% of conservative Republicans understand or accept that climate change is happening. So there's a big difference there between the 84% of Republicans in Florida who understand that climate change or global warming is happening, and, the moderate Republicans across the U.S. is only 61%. That's a big discrepancy.
It is, and again, I think here the explanation can be at least partially linked with people's lived experiences, or again, even the experiences of their neighbors or their friends who are also in Florida. So it's just arguably something that's more in our faces here in the news. One of the interesting things, though, that you touched on a moment ago is, well, Floridians are used to it, right? We live here, and that's true, except for those who are recent arrivals. And that really makes the story for me as an academic more interesting. I don't have the answer, but in every one of our surveys, 15 to 20% or so of our respondents are new arrivals. They've only been here 0 to 5 years. And, we're undergoing a population boom. 1,000 people a day, basically on average, come to Florida. Well, they're coming from elsewhere, and it's, a lot from the Northeast or in Eastern Canada. And the climate things that those people think about, I know, having lived there, are quite different. So maybe something that happens here too rather quickly is that regardless of where you come from, you start to adopt this climate-heavy atmosphere of conversation.
So new arrivals have a greater acceptance of the reality of climate change, but also better educated people too, I noticed from your survey. Is that right?
There's a bit of that, a slight indication of that. So one of the things that we see is that folks with a college degree are about 10 percentage points more likely to have a belief and concern about climate change than folks who, say, just have a high school education.
But it's not that's not a large percentage change, 10%, but that is a change.
It is, and it's the Florida number that we have from our survey. One of the things, though, that I want to try and get away from is the conversation about the direct link between someone's education in school and their belief in climate change, their interest or their concern about it, and their support for what they might, different policy options for fighting climate change. And that's been a trend in a lot of the research is, well, let's just link it with education because, the more science people have, the more surely everybody then will agree. It turns out that's not exactly how it plays out. People instead tend to view the science that they hear about through their own personal, cultural and social lenses. And so it's a little more interesting than just level of education.
Yeah, I've seen in research from years ago that very intelligent people tend to seek confirmation bias. So it's not necessarily you present them with data, they look at it in a nonpartisan, kind of unbiased way, and then they say, okay, now I believe or I don't believe. It's they look for the data that supports the narrative that already is in their brain. Is that right?
Well, that happens a bit to all of us. We're all human. When I see my favorite football team out on the field, I kind of interpret what I see in light of my wanting them to win, even if they're really shooting themselves in the foot. So we're all subject to biases like that. We call them heuristics. But just one anecdote. I know a person who's got a PhD in astrophysics from Princeton, and that kind of combination of qualifications, suggests quite smart and also well science literate, and couldn't be more opposed to the whole idea of climate change on a scientific level as well as political and policy. So it's just one example, but it's borne out in the data in our surveys and in the national surveys, is that it's not just about education.
Right. And I do want to dig more into that. So I want to dig into that, but just remind me if I forget, I want to ask you about teaching climate in schools. I find that to be really interesting, but I want to dig into what you just said a little bit more, which is, so then what is it then? It's amazing because the climate science community has produced tens of thousands of paper. We've reached the gold standard of proof that shows that humans are causing climate change. I mean, you literally couldn't get any more data and support for it. It's at the 99.99% level in terms of the science that supports human-caused climate change. And yet, you can throw all those papers at some people, and they'll never believe that climate change is either happening or B, more likely, that it's caused by humans. So what exactly is behind then their decision to accept or not accept climate change as being human-caused?
Well, for that group, the answer is, again, people's personal cultural lenses through which they interpret all of the messages that they encounter on a daily basis. And to be a little more specific about it, in this case, the answer is often, well, fine, you're showing me all these scientific studies, but I don't like AOC. And she's behind this, and so I'm going to resist you until until the cows come home. So it's a matter of associating. It's not as really about the science. It's a matter of associating the messenger, not the science, the message, but the messenger, whoever, if it's a scientist, it's one thing, but some scientists these days have really left the academic perch of neutrality and are in the public conversation. And sometimes they get associated, intentionally or not, with, I don't know, the Al Gores and the AOCs and the John Kerrys of the world. And so I'm simply reporting from their mouths, that is the conservatives who are antagonistic to the whole enterprise, that, for instance, they say, I've heard one of them say, well, the Green New Deal, to us, when we hear that, we hear 1 part green and 9 parts New Deal. So no deal.
Right. Yeah.
It's the opposite of a conversation starter.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many directions we can go with this conversation. Obviously, people are concerned about what it means, right? If they admit to themselves that climate change is happening and it's a threat, then what's the next step? It means compromising perhaps on policy. It means policies they may not necessarily like. A lot of people are afraid they're going to be taxed, or that the government's going to control their lives, or something like that. I think the reason why scientists are stepping off of this neutral perch is because scientific information is not neutral, right? It either is yes or it's no in most cases. And in the case of climate change, there's overwhelming evidence that yes, it's happening, it's caused by humans. So they realize that there's an urgency to get this done, and they're pushing as hard as they can to convince people and even enter the policy fray if they have to essentially, in their minds, at least save the world, right? They think that at some point, Earth is going to become tough to be a habitable place for humans, or at least for a lot of species of animals. So that, of course, is the reasoning behind why so many scientists are saying, all right, I got to get involved with this. I can't just be publishing scientific information.
Yes, and it's natural, and in some regards, for me, I think it's very welcome. But what has happened is, I think, where the scientists or the whole community of communicators, if you will, trying to broaden the support base for the issue has fallen short, is in being an open listener. So for me, it's entirely legitimate that if you are starting the conversation on the right wing of things as a self-described conservative and such, you would be suspicious and hesitant. But believe me, there are a lot of conservatives who are suspicious of the AOCs and Al Gores of the world, but who do listen to reason and are scientifically literate, and who are therefore open to some kind of work together.
It is really too bad that it's become politicized. As someone with a science background myself, it bothers me a lot because this is a real problem. It's a big problem. It's something we need to move on quickly. And the fact that it became politicized in the past 10 to 20 years has really caused some big problems here. I want to just go back to the question of schools. This I found interesting. So in your survey, your latest survey, 71% of Floridians believe that climate change should be taught in the schools K through 12. Now, I don't know how that compares with the rest of the U.S., but I do know that Florida has approved climate denial or disinformation videos to be used in the school curriculum in classrooms. So if a teacher wants to use a climate denial or disinformation video, they can now in the state of Florida. But as far as I know, there isn't necessarily a mandate to teach climate change yet. With that said, 71% of Floridians believe it should be taught in schools. Did I get that all correct?
Well, as far as the numbers from our survey, yes. I'm not familiar with all the details of what materials have been approved or at least not declined.
Prager Institute materials specifically is yeah.
Well, so that I view that as problematic. I've encountered a good number of high school teachers and middle school teachers in Florida who are really eager to teach about the topic. They're not really schooled in it in their own background and training, so they want help. But when push comes to shove, they have no time to teach it anyway. Most of them are hesitant to teach it because they know they could get a lot of blowback from the parents or the administrators, but they don't have the time. But to go further into the poll result, what's really interesting is that the Republican support to teach in our survey climate change in our K to 12 schools. In that case, it's over 50%. So this is where, again, I think Florida is deviating from the national picture on the partisan split on climate. And the reason I started asking this particular survey question is because I knew that what we do in our schools as a society is often a hot button issue. It's kind of a go-to in the culture wars, and we've seen that in the last couple of years in a number of different topics. But climate hasn't been one of those, and so that may be that the elected folks who lead those charges know that the Florida public, the Republicans, are over half already in support of teaching it to their children. So I think that, to me, promises, well, one of the things I say sometimes is Florida might be the first big red domino to fall among the red states.
In the direction of climate change, or at least combating climate change. We see a lot of attempts to adapt to climate change here in Florida, but not necessarily to combat the root cause of climate change here in Florida necessarily in terms of policy, in terms of money that's allotted to this. But that's the case, I think, coast to coast when it comes to the difference between the way Democrats want to handle climate change and the way that Republicans want to handle climate change. I'm talking about policymakers, not the general public. That Republicans are more willing to adapt and spend money on adapting to climate change, but not necessarily going after, essentially stopping the use or slowing the use of fossil fuels.
Exactly. And so that's a pretty common trend. One interesting counter to that, though, is Texas. in Arizona, I think, is also in that category, where you have pretty red states, and in Texas's case, a very heavily petrochemical dominated economy. But it turns out that in the last 5 years or so, maybe more like 10 by now, they have cultivated a market for wind and solar that is literally top 1 or 2 in the country.
Yeah.
So there's now a constituency in Texas to continue producing large amounts of electricity from renewable wind and solar. And so it kind of is coexisting there in an interesting, novel way.
Listen, I'm a meteorologist. I know about the wind in West Texas, and if they didn't utilize it, they'd be missing out on what is a lot of free energy, essentially, in West Texas. So, yeah, they are by far the biggest wind producer in the country right now. I know California is a leader in solar, although what's interesting is that Florida, in terms of the additional solar added this year, has outpaced both California and Texas. So all of a sudden, Florida is really pushing forward very good. It's mostly utility. It's like 86% utility, not necessarily rooftop solar. But the utilities here, for whatever reason, maybe you can school me on why. Why are the utilities all of a sudden saying, yes, now's the time to invest in solar in Florida? Is it the IRA? Is it federal incentives? I'm not really sure.
Well, for sure, the federal incentives from 2 years ago have played a role in whatever push you've seen in Florida and probably elsewhere to create more solar energy capacity. However, this trend that you correctly note predates the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. So what is then the cause? Well, in Florida, the primary fuel mix for our energy is coal, natural gas, and a little bit of nuclear. And so the utilities started to see, independent of the Inflation Reduction Act, the cost for solar plummeting below the cost for coal. And so we've retained in the utilities the natural gas as kind of a backstop, but they're going real quick on producing solar capacity because it's cheaper than coal.
Right. Yeah. So the economics are in the favor of renewable energy now, and that's not going to change. I mean, technology just, I always use this analogy, and I think somehow it comes up in almost every show because it's applicable in almost every show. 10 years ago, you tried to buy a big screen TV. It was $5,000. Now you buy it, it's like $300, So that's the advantage of technology versus commodities. Commodities go up and down, gold, silver, diamonds, whatever. But when it comes to the sun and the wind, as long as you can develop the technology to harness it, and of course it gets cheaper and cheaper as you make more and more of it, there becomes an economic advantage. So that's interesting. But Florida is a sunshine state, right? Why not use the sun to power our state? And certainly the utilities are moving in that direction pretty quickly. Listen, rather than me kind of ask the next question, I want to ask you, what is the most interesting thing to you about the findings of the work that you've been doing for about the past 5 years now?
I appreciate the opportunity there, Jeff, to reflect back. And the answer is, as I said before, so I'll frame it as a question. Is Florida the first big red domino to fall nationwide in a way that opens the door for the Republican Party and the Democratic Party to talk about climate in a different way? California, as you say, is already well along in renewables and production and EV incentives and so on. They're not a Republican state. Same in Massachusetts and New York. They're not Republican states. But Texas and Arizona and Louisiana and Florida are. And so if the conversation is going to produce what I call a durable climate consensus, then we have to have a shift in the basic parameters of the conversation. And that's what's happening in Florida. So my question is, how high a level of support among Republicans in Florida do we need for this issue to really be off the table as something that can be
discussed and agreed to? And
exactly. So we may be already above that threshold, right? It's a majority rule country. So we're over 50% of Republicans in this state. But do we really need to be closer to 59 or 61 in order for the issue to be off the table as a hot button topic every election. I don't know what that number is, but so that's one of the things we're looking for, and then hope to one day track it in other states too.
You know, I noticed one thing that I know that you are really interested in is getting this conversation away from the insults. Now, I saw that was mentioned in the email, that essentially there's this condescending feel and wording about people who don't accept the reality of climate change. And that's something that I can tell, desperately want to get away from. Is that right?
It is. And for me, it's a very salient part of the conversations that I have with conservatives as well as with liberals. It just goes the other direction. And it just is toxic. And now you could apply the same analysis to any hot button issue, right? Whether it's war in Ukraine or COVID or the list goes on. Really, politics sometimes gets personal and insulting, and then people's feelings get hurt, even if they don't say it that way, and then they have long memories, and so they become isolated in their own echo chambers and hurl insults from afar. Listen, I'm working on climate, and I just am ready to, start anew, but that has to mean that we really are open listeners. There can't be any implicit or explicit condescending. Both sides we can point to as having, gone off the rails, but also we have to, some of the social media people, it's like they're maybe overrepresented in our minds.
That's right, of course.
So it's, and I'll tell you an anecdote. Just a few weeks ago, President Biden was here in Florida in the wake of Hurricane Idalia. And he was doing what presidents do, which is showing empathy and sympathy and probably announcing some support for recovery. And I guess a reporter asked something along the lines of, well, do you think this hurricane, Mr. President, is a sign of climate change? And his response, as was reported in the media, and this is the type of thing that just happens a lot, too much, was, well, no one intelligent can deny that climate change is real anymore. And, I'm not saying making global statements about President Biden. I think he's a remarkable man and he's done remarkable things, but that kind of comment that just slips out easily is detrimental, and it kind of puts people on the other side, or who are, politically, ideologically, not like the president, on the defensive. But we don't need that. Right. The science is settled. What is not settled is what exactly needs to be done and how and when, by whom, and what trade-offs will be shouldered by which people. That is a legitimate area for debate.
Right.
If there's an implication that people are not intelligent because they have concerns, that just starts the conversation dead.
One thing I have to say that I try to stay away from is I never tell people what to do. I say, here's what you can do. Just do what you can do. People will say, well, what can I do to help? Or, or there are people who make the implication, well, you have to stop eating meat and you should stop driving a gas guzzling truck and you should do this and you should do that. And immediately people recede when you tell them what to do. In fact, they probably just go further away from helping with the issue. I never tell people, I don't eat meat. I drive a hybrid plug-in car. I live in a condo rather than a home. I do all the things that I should do to walk the walk, right? Not be a hypocrite. If I know the science and I'm going to communicate the science, and I ought to walk the walk. But I never tell other people to do it. I don't think it's right to do. I think it's got to be their decision. And I think if you just tell people, here are your options if you'd like to help, whichever one you can help with, if you can do 2 or 3, that's great. But never explicitly saying you need to do this. And I think that's kind of where this movement went wrong at the beginning.
For sure. So whenever there's an implication, or it might be stated, that who's they are going to come tell us we can't have our gas stoves, for example, but there are many other examples. Right away, you're off to a bad start in the conversation. There needs to be, individual choice. I think pretty much nobody likes to pay taxes, by the way, on any end of the political spectrum. Nobody likes to have to modify their daily routines if for no other reason that routines are routine, right? That we're comfortable with them. And so if suddenly we need to change how we fuel our vehicles, that requires, it's a little annoying. I did that myself and it took a while. But anyway, it's for sure, we need to balance to the maximum extent possible, allowing people to select how they make their contributions to reducing greenhouse gas emissions is preferable than coming in with a predefined playbook that everybody has to follow. That's not only would that probably not work because it's hard to design such a thing, it wouldn't go over well.
One last thing I want to talk about, and then we'll kind of end on your last thought, is it seems that the policy, the Inflation Reduction Act, which has a terrible name if it's going to be combating climate change at least, but it's making some huge progress in infusing cash into places that are oftentimes red states. Something like 80% of the benefits from that bill are going to red states, the battery belt being one, Georgia, Tennessee, South Carolina. And jobs are pouring into these communities that have been desolate for years when so much of the manufacturing was shipped overseas. This is changing the politics of climate change, in a way, taking it off the table in those communities, because those communities, they're making money off of the transition from, oil and gas and coal over to green. So that I would make that point, number one. And number two, it's never vilifying folks who worked in oil, gas, and coal. It's what got us to where we are right now. It's why we have the creature comforts that we have and the technology we have, and the reason why we're a superpower. But understanding the deep cultural ties that I visited Eastern Kentucky and spoke to someone who worked in coal. His father worked in coal. His father worked in coal. His father almost died in coal. The guy that I was interviewing and talking to was sick. He was probably, honestly, a year or two from, I don't want to go any further than saying what, I think you understand where I'm going with this. He was very sick. And I said, did you regret working in coal? He said, absolutely not. This is who I am. So I think that there needs to be a greater understanding of the people that actually work in that industry and them not being vilified, and also understanding that by creating these new jobs in a lot of essentially red areas, that the politics are changing, that these people are embracing the transition, even if they're not saying climate change is real.
Yeah, you hit a couple of really good nails there on the head, Jeff. On the one hand, you're starting to see the Inflation Reduction Act is so new that we're only now starting to see politicians run and develop, a record and a public identity with the IRA in their rearview mirrors. And so, but what has started to emerge is candidates saying, I'm against climate change, but look, aren't you happy with this battery plant that I helped get here with the 800 jobs that it brought? And those two things don't really work well together. And so my prediction is that over time, they will favor the local benefits of the plant over the kind of national level posturing. Now, that is contingent on the effects of the IRA actually lasting. There is a decent chance that with a shift in the power in Washington next fall, that the IRA could be repealed and the bipartisan infrastructure law as well. So all these tremendous investments could be either partially or wholly reversed at the stroke of a pen, more or less. And so, but if these changes in the economy are lasting, then I do think there'll be a shift in the red state politics.
Right. Okay, so listen, I'm going to give you a last word. Anything else you want to say before we go?
Well, I just, first of all, I'm grateful for what you do and also for having me on the show. I would return to this one question that I have and invite your viewers to help, because I'm an academic and I'm looking for answers to what I think are interesting and important questions. And the question is, what a level of public support do we need to see in the Republican electorate before we can say that the issue is really a durable climate consensus? And we're approaching that number, I believe, whatever it might be in Florida. So it would be nice to have a durable consensus, because then we don't flip-flop every 2 or 4 years in terms of policy directions.
Well, great. Thank you for that. This has been, I think, really interesting. Honestly, out of all the things that I study in climate change, this is, I think, public opinion is one of the most interesting. So, Dr. Colin Polsky, thank you so much for joining me. You can go to our WFLA website and you can click on the Climate Classroom tab. So under weather, go to the Climate Classroom tab, and you can find the latest article, which will have links to Dr. Polsky's work. Also, by the way, I'll mention that you can watch this where you're watching it right now or listening to it right now on either our Facebook page, in addition, WFLA.com. We package this show and we send it to YouTube, so you can watch this on YouTube. And in addition, you can listen to it as a podcast on Spotify and also Apple Podcasts. So I want to thank everybody for joining me today. I want to wish you a great rest of your week and a great weekend as well. And I'll see you again in the next couple of weeks for Climate Classroom.
Watch or listen to Jeff's Climate Classroom, powered by Armor View Window and Door on WFLA social media platforms, and find Jeff's climate reports on WFLA.com.